All right, so today we're going to do something a little different. We're cracking open a book from all the way back in 1882 to look at a debate that honestly feels like it could be happening right now. We're talking faith, healing, and miracles. Let's dive into this 140-year-old take on a very modern question.
And this really gets to the heart of what the author is asking. Think about it. Why is a miracle from the ancient world seen as, a pillar of faith, but a similar story today gets met with instant skepticism? It's a really provocative question, and it sets the stage for a surprisingly deep argument.
So, where are we getting all this from? It's a book called The Ministry of Healing, written by a theologian named A.J. Gordon way back in 1882. You have to remember, he's writing this as modern science is just exploding, and he's seeing this growing tension between that ancient faith and the new modern way of thinking. So, to really get inside his head, we're just going to follow his own roadmap. We'll start with his case for divine healing, then we'll look at the tricky limits of prayer, compare how we judge old miracles versus new ones, and then switch gears to his warnings and his call for balance.
Okay, so Gordon kicks things off not with some big demand to believe, but with what he calls a verdict of candor, basically an honest, open-minded look at the possibility of supernatural healing.
For Gordon, the number one most important thing to get is this. The result of any prayer for healing doesn't just come down to how much faith a person has. He says the absolute foundational limit is always the gracious and all-wise will of God. And that one idea, right there, really shapes everything else he's about to say. And that, of course, leads to a really big question. If it's all up to God's will, then how on earth do we know what's best to pray for? To make his point, Gordon uses these two incredible stories from history that show just how clueless we can be about what we're asking for. And just look at the contrast here. It's fascinating. On one hand, you've got this devout father who is so fed up with his son's bad behavior that he actually prays for God to just take him. Then on the other side, you have a mother desperately begging for her infant son, who everyone thought was going to die, to be saved. Two really passionate prayers with completely opposite goals. And boom, here's the paradox. The son that the father had given up on, Isaac Barrow, he grows up to become one of the most respected theologians of his day. And the infant son who was spared? King Charles I, who ended his life executed on a scaffold. Gordon's point is crystal clear. Our most passionate prayers are often based on a really, really limited point of view.
Okay, so let's move on and see how he builds on this idea when it comes to evidence. This is where Gordon really tackles that first question we asked. Why do we treat miracle stories from way back when so differently from stories we hear today?
So Gordon's argument is that we've kind of got it all backwards. We tend to think, well, the miracles in the Bible are believable because they're in a sacred book. But he flips that around. He says, no, the miracles came first, and people believed them based on the exact same kind of evidence we have today. Just regular people like us, saying, hey, I saw this happen.
And this is where he drops a major warning. He says, if you're a person of faith, and you just wave away modern miracle stories from honest people as silly tales, you're actually, without realizing it, building a front porch to the school of David Hume, who was a famous philosopher who argued against all miracles. The logic is pretty simple. If you trash the eyewitness testimony from modern miracles, you're weakening the very foundation that the ancient ones stand on. You can see why he was so worried. He felt like this inconsistency was creating a real crisis of faith, making it way too easy to just deny the supernatural altogether. But, and this is a really big but, Gordon isn't just saying go believe every single claim you hear. Not at all. He immediately pivots to what he calls a verdict of caution, and he urges people to take a hard look at the spiritual condition of the church itself. He points out this really troubling pattern. The more wealthy, the more prosperous, the more comfortable the church gets, the less it feels like it desperately needs to depend on God. And when that sense of dependence starts to fade, well, so does the faith that makes miracles possible. Sound familiar?
So here's the kicker. Individual moments of great faith don't just happen in a bubble. Gordon suggests that they're connected to the overall spiritual health of the community. If the church as a whole is more concerned with worldly things and being self-sufficient, you just can't expect to see the same kind of supernatural power you'd see when it was poor, persecuted, and had to rely on God for everything. And all of this builds to his final, and maybe his most important point. To really get this right, he says, you have to hold two truths that seem to contradict each other in perfect balance. If you don't, you risk falling into heresy. Now, his definition of heresy is super interesting. He's not talking about just being flat out wrong. He says it's often about taking one piece of the truth, a single verse even, and blowing it up so big and pushing it so far that you completely ignore the other side of the coin, the other truth that's meant to balance it out.
And this slide just lays that tension out perfectly. On the one hand, you've got this incredible wide-open promise, ask what you will. But on the other hand, you have this critical condition. It has to be according to his will. For Gordon, real faith means holding both of these in your hands at the same time and not letting one erase the other.
And he's like, look, this isn't some new problem. Just look at the Apostle Paul. In one instance, Paul performs this amazing dramatic healing. But in another, he has to leave his good friend and co-worker Trophimus behind because the man was just too sick to travel. So even in the very beginning, it was never a simple push-button formula.
And he closes out this whole section with this just devastating story. Apparently, Pope Gregory was admiring all the treasures of the church and said to the famous theologian Thomas Aquinas something like, "The church can no longer say, 'Silver and gold have I none.'" And Aquinas' reply was just haunting. He said, "No, nor can she say any longer, 'In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk.'"
So that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? Gordon was writing this back in 1882, and he was worried about the wealth and comfort of his own era. So now, in our time, an age of material prosperity that he couldn't have even imagined, is his warning that gaining earthly riches might come at the cost of spiritual power more relevant than it has ever been?